大家好，我叫宋在玉。
我叫JoonHan.
And today we are going to talk about the Opium War and its history. However, we must talk about the events that led up to the war.
The Opium War occurred in the 18th century, and it involved the British and the Chinese. The British just came out from a really huge loss in its overseas colonies in the Indias. They had a really huge trade deficit with China because the British really loved tea, and so they were importing millions of pounds of tea every year. At that time, the British economy was pretty much propped up by tea because of how much tea they were importing.
In 1792, the British came out of a war that costed most of its national treasury and their colony in North America. The British needed new sources of revenue, and the British knew that they loved tea, but the Chinese was very strict on the trade. They had free rein on how much tariff they put on the British goods. So, the British wanted to find a way to counteract the large trade deficit, so they sent representatives in the East India Company, tried to negotiate with the emperor but had failed, therefore they turned to selling opium. The East India Company set up a market in Calcutta, began growing poppies, made them into opium, so that they can sell them to the Chinese. The foreign-made opium was much more potent than the locally made opium in China, so the Chinese sought them more, thus making sales skyrocket. The Chinese government obviously hated this, so in the spring of 1839, the Chinese government confiscated and destroyed more than 20,000 chests of opium.
A really big factor during the Opium War was the technological superiority that the British enjoyed over the Chinese. The Chinese were actually once technologically superior to all the Western powers during the 17th century. This could be seen because of the huge leaps of silk technology and gunpowder technology that the Chinese developed during the 17th century. But due to China adopting a closed society where they did not interact with foreign powers at all, almost, by the time the Opium War came around, which was during the 18th century, the Chinese actually were very highly technologically inferior to the Western powers. And this could be seen during the Opium War when the Chinese war junks fought against the British gunships. They were no match in size or firepower. And also during the Opium War, the British developed a new steam-powered ship called the Nemesis. And this was a very powerful ship because it was not only wind-powered but also steam-powered, so it has a really high top speed.
Hostilities broke out when British warships destroyed a Chinese blockade of the Zhujiang estuary at Hong Kong. The British government decided in early 1840 to send an expeditionary force to China, which arrived at Hong Kong in June. The British fleet proceeded up the Zhujiang estuary to Guangzhou, and after months of negotiations there, they attacked and occupied the city in May 1841. Subsequent British campaigns over the next year were likewise successful against the inferior Qing forces, despite a determined counterattack by Chinese troops in the spring of 1842. The British held against that offense, however, and captured Nanjing in late August, which put an end to the fighting.
During the course of the Opium War, there were two times where peace talks were commenced by both sides. The first peace talk commenced before the capture of Nanjing by the British, and the treaty was that the Chinese will pay £6 million to the British, and the British would pay the £6 million back to the Chinese for the island of Hong Kong, where the British merchants would trade under British rule. However, this treaty was not accepted by both the Chinese or the British because the Chinese did not accept giving piece of their land to a foreign power, while the British were not able to get the war reparations that they desperately needed through this treaty. The second peace talk commenced after the capture of Nanjing by the British, and this was much more of a harsh treaty to the Chinese. £20 million were given by the Chinese to the British. Hong Kong Island was given by the Chinese to the British, where the British couldn't trade freely. However, two terms were not met by the Chinese, or the Chinese did not accept these two terms. The first one was that opium was still not allowed in China, and Christian missionaries were not allowed to be sent by the British to the Chinese.
The Opium Wars and the following treaties went down into Chinese history as the Unequal Treaties, which was later regarded by the communist government as the century of humiliation. These unequal treaties has become seared into the Chinese consciousness, and to this day are conjured whenever dealings with the West take a turn for the worse. These wars have had a profound impact on global politics and global understanding all the way to today.